There is no awakening of consciousness without pain. These words of Carl Jung carry a truth that many only understand after experiencing something that completely changes the way they see life. Perhaps you are going through this right now. Perhaps you have experienced a spiritual awakening that, instead of bringing clarity, brought confusion, instead of more light, more shadow. And contrary to what many imagine, this awakening did not come accompanied by motivation, purpose, or renewed energy. It came with fatigue, emptiness, and silence. You feel as though you've lost your inner fire, that motivation that once made you get out of bed, dream, take action. It simply vanished, and you try to find answers. You try to meditate more, read more, understand more. But everything feels artificial. Nothing fills you. Nothing inspires you. Nothing moves you. And here is the big truth that few have the courage to say: losing motivation after a spiritual awakening is not a mistake. It is not a setback. It is a symptom, a sign that something much deeper is happening within you, a psychic transformation process that challenges everything you thought you were. And at this moment, logic doesn't help. Motivational formulas don't work. Because what is at stake here is the reconstruction of your soul. Carl Jung understood this with rare lucidity. He realized that spiritual awakening is not an end, but a beginning, a breaking point between what you believed yourself to be and what you truly are. And that rupture, that interval between masks falling and truths yet unborn, is what many experience as a loss of meaning and motivation. Today, we are going to dive into this psychic territory, exploring 5 deep reasons, based on Jung's analytical psychology, for why so many people feel lost after a spiritual awakening. And more than that, we will understand why that loss of motivation can actually be the portal to an authentic inner transformation, an inevitable passage on the journey of individuation. But before we continue, I want to ask you an honest and perhaps uncomfortable question. Is the emptiness you're feeling now really a problem? Or could it be an invitation? An invitation to stop seeking outside and truly begin listening to what is alive within you. If you are willing to make this crossing with me, let's go together. What you feel now may be the prelude to a new soul being born, a soul that does not live to meet expectations, but to express its most intimate truth. A soul that does not cling to ideas of right and wrong, but dances with its own symbols and meanings. By the end of this video, you will not only have 5 answers, you will have a new perspective on the very crisis you are living, and perhaps you will discover that losing motivation was the exact point where your real journey began. For much of your life, you learned to present yourself to the world in a certain way. You adopted behaviors, ways of speaking, modes of thinking, even tastes that in many cases were not born from you, but were inherited, copied, or molded to meet the expectations of your environment. Carl Jung called this social adaptation the persona. The persona is the mask we wear to function in the world. It is useful, necessary to a certain extent, but when you begin to confuse it with who you really are, the risk of inner alienation arises. Now imagine, you spend years, perhaps decades, investing energy to sustain this persona, the image of the successful, professional, the exemplary mother, the balanced spiritualist, the obedient child. The mask grows stronger, and the world responds positively. You are accepted, and over time you begin to believe that this is who you are, that you are that image, that voice that pleases, that role that works. But then comes the spiritual awakening, and with it, a rupture. That which once made sense now feels empty. The routine that once satisfied you becomes unbearable. Conversations, commitments, even the clothes in your closet, everything begins to sound like theater. And worst of all, you realize you no longer know who you are behind the character. This is the moment when the persona begins to crumble, and when the persona collapses, the feeling is one of disorientation. You may continue going to work, smiling in meetings, taking care of the house, but inside there exists a persistent sensation of disconnection. You feel out of place, as if you were living someone else's life. Motivation disappears because that which once moved you, approval, recognition, social goals, no longer holds power over you. And here comes a crucial point. Many people interpret this collapse as a personal crisis, as if something were going wrong with them. But in truth, it is the opposite. It is a sign that the psyche is seeking to reorganize itself, that the true self, the most authentic core of your identity, is trying to emerge. And for that to happen, old structures must fall away. Jung said that the persona cannot be destroyed all at once because it still performs essential functions, but it needs to be relativized. It needs to be seen for what it is, an adaptive construction. The problem arises when it falls suddenly, as often happens after a spiritual awakening, in which case the soul enters a suspension period. There is no longer the character, but there is not yet a new inner rooting, and this in-between generates confusion, apathy, and a loss of purpose. Have you ever wondered why? After awakening, so many people cannot return to their old jobs, why they lose interest in places they once attended with pleasure, why they feel a strange aversion to certain social circles, even without being able to explain exactly why. This happens because these areas of life were deeply tied to the persona, and now, without the persona as center, those structures lose their shine. But this process is not a mistake. It is a call for you to ask yourself honestly, who am I when I am not trying to please anyone? Who am I when I am not fitting into any role? What remains of me when the masks fall? These questions do not bring immediate answers. On the contrary, they open space for silence, for discomfort, for not knowing. And it is in this unknown terrain that the true self begins to manifest. Little by little, you begin to perceive what truly nourishes you, which conversations ignite you, which projects give you energy, which relationships expand your soul. But this does not happen overnight. There is an inevitable transition period in which you feel like a nobody, where no identity suits you, where everything seems deconstructed, fragmented. It's like being in a forest at night, without a map, without a flashlight, and yet feeling there is no turning back. Jung compared this moment to the alchemical process of dissolution. In alchemy, elements are heated to separate the essential from the illusory. In deep psychology, the dissolution of the persona allows the self, the symbolic center of the psyche, to begin to emerge. But first you must endure the void. You must accept that for a time you will be nobody in the eyes of the world, and perhaps not even in your own eyes. And this is the true inner work. Sustaining, not knowing, not doing, not appearing, without fleeing from yourself, without running back to comfortable masks. The loss of motivation that arises here is not a symptom of spiritual failure. It is the sacred interval between the old persona that fell and the new self that has not yet been born. If you can remain in this space even without answers, something within you will begin to reorganize, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. And that is why Jung said, becoming conscious of oneself is a task that demands sacrifice. Sacrifice of certainties, of images, of roles. But what is gained when this void is crossed is priceless. It is the possibility of living an authentic, aligned, alive life. Perhaps the motivation you seek is not lost. Perhaps it is only waiting for you to stop acting in order to finally begin to exist. Little is said about this, but it is inevitable. Every light you kindle casts a new shadow. After a spiritual awakening, many expect to find peace, serenity, and elevation. But what they actually find is a mirror, and in that mirror they see parts of themselves that they spent their whole lives trying to hide. Anger, envy, fear, pride, repressed sexuality, accumulated frustrations, all that was swept under the rug of consciousness now begins to emerge. Carl Jung called this hidden dimension the shadow, not because it is necessarily evil, but because it lies outside the light of consciousness. The shadow is everything we reject, deny, or project onto others. It is formed both by socially unacceptable aspects, like aggression and vanity, and by forgotten potentials, undeveloped talents, stifled legitimate desires, suffocated creative impulses. The problem is that when you awaken spiritually, you expand your perception. And this new perception does not come selectively. It does not illuminate only what is beautiful or divine. It also reveals what is repressed. And that encounter with the shadow, when it occurs suddenly and without psychological preparation, can be overwhelming. Many people, upon confronting this hidden side of themselves, collapse emotionally. They feel shame for what they discover, blame themselves, withdraw. The old image they had of themselves, often idealized and spiritualized, is confronted with internal realities that seem contradictory. How can I feel so irritated, so anxious, so lost, if I've just awakened? The question seems logical, but carries a trap. It still expects perfection. Jung reminds us that true growth lies not in suppressing the shadow, but in integrating it. And integration is not about justifying destructive behaviors, nor about identifying with the pain. It is learning to recognize these parts, naming them, conversing with them, as if they were internal figures waiting to be heard for a long time. When this integration process fails, the psyche enters conflict, and the energy that once fueled advance in life, creating, acting, relating, begins to be drained by silent internal battles. Stagnation, fatigue, and apathy arise. Motivation disappears because a war is happening inside you, and the more you try to ignore it, the stronger it grows. Have you ever felt paralyzed by emotions you can't even explain? Ever had disproportionate reactions to small situations? Ever found yourself trapped in repetitive behavior patterns, even after so much self-knowledge? In many cases, this is the shadow manifesting, and the more spiritual you try to be, the stronger it can become, not out of malice, but because it demands recognition. Spirituality, when disconnected from the psyche, becomes an escape, a way to flee from the real pain that needs to be crossed. And Jung was clear on this point. No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In other words, it is not about being pure, but about being whole. The problem is that many spiritual systems reinforce the denial of the shadow. They demand constant positivity, unconditional compassion, gratitude at all costs, and these demands can make you repress your human emotions even more, making the shadow denser, more reactive, more dominant, until it explodes or paralyzes you completely. You feel you've lost motivation, but in truth you are trying to maintain a divided psychic field. One part of you wants to move forward, grow, be illuminated. The other part, the one that harbors old resentments, fears, and wounds, wants to be heard. And until these two voices look into each other's eyes, there will be no unity sufficient to move the soul. But there is a way. Everything begins with a simple yet courageous gesture. Stop judging your own feelings. Observe what is arising within you without trying to change it immediately. Recognize your anger without identifying with it. Look at your sadness without wanting to fix it. Welcome fear as a frightened child who does not need correction, but presence. True motivation, the kind that is born from the center of the soul, emerges only when you are whole. And to be whole, you must include. Include what you most fear in yourself. Include what you consider unworthy, shameful, contradictory, because deep down, those parts you reject are trying to protect you. They arose as defenses in moments of pain, and now, after the awakening, they can finally be seen not as enemies, but as messengers. Jung said that the shadow is 90% gold. That means that, by integrating what was repressed, we discover potentials we never imagined having. Anger transforms into courage. Fear transforms into attention. Sadness transforms into empathy. But this only happens when you choose to look within with sincerity. You have not lost your motivation. You are simply faced with a part of yourself that was never heard with love. And perhaps it is this listening, this reconciliation with your own shadow, that will open the way to an energy far more authentic and creative than anything you have ever experienced. Therefore, do not run away, do not judge yourself. Allow yourself to meet that which you avoided for so long, because it is in this encounter, difficult, lonely, transformative, that you find the thread of your own soul again. There is a common and dangerous confusion on the spiritual path. The idea that the ego is an enemy to be eliminated. Contrary to what is thought, Jung never advocated destroying the ego. What he proposed was integration. The ego, for Jung, is an essential psychic structure. It is the center of consciousness. It is the point of reference from which we organize our inner life and our actions in the world. Without the ego, we cannot sustain our individuality. We cannot say, I think, I feel, I choose. It is the ego that gives us the capacity to position ourselves in relation to the world. However, when we undergo a spiritual awakening, this structure collapses, not because the ego is false, but because it is no longer sufficient to contain the new dimension of consciousness that has begun to emerge. For some people, the ego dissolves temporarily. They enter altered states of perception where everything seems one, divine, infinite. There is a feeling of lightness, expansion, total absence of separation. This experience can be profoundly liberating, but paradoxically, it can also leave a huge void when it ends, because upon returning to everyday life, the person no longer knows how to orient themselves. They no longer know how to act, and everything seems small, limited, frustrating. Other people follow a different path. Instead of dissolving the ego, they inflate it. They believe they know everything now, that they are more evolved, more conscious than others. They begin to identify with grandiose archetypes, the healer, the master, the chosen one. This psychic inflation is a defense mechanism. The ego, threatened by contents greater than itself, tries to protect itself by assuming a superior position. But this inflation is fragile, because it is not sustained by integration but by compensation. Whether through dissolution or inflation, the result is the same, a disconnection from the functional ego. That ego that organizes, plans, executes, the one that helps us transform intuitions into actions. Without it, everything seems abstract. Life becomes a series of profound thoughts and subtle sensations, but without anchoring in reality. Motivation disappears, not because there is no will, but because there is no internal structure to bring that will into the world. Have you ever felt like you were floating, with no ground? Ever had incredible ideas, but no energy to put them into practice? Ever perceived yourself full of consciousness, but incapable of dealing with an overdue bill, a difficult conversation, or a simple daily routine? That is not laziness, it is ego disorganization. Jung reminds us that the ego is an adaptation function. It is not the villain, it is the channel through which the self, that deeper, more encompassing instance of the psyche, manifests in reality. The ego should not be abolished, but aligned with the self. When this happens, the ego becomes a servant of something greater, without losing its organizing function. But until that integration occurs, the ego lives between extremes, either feeling diminished and powerless or inflated and disconnected. And that is why, after awakening, so many people feel they have lost the will to live their ordinary lives. Spirituality seems something too elevated to mix with work, relationships, responsibilities. But the real challenge is precisely that, finding the bridge, bringing heaven to earth, anchoring spirit in matter. What is at stake here is not just motivation, it is identity. You are trying to understand who you are after everything that has collapsed. And the ego, without a clear function, is like a captain lost at sea. That is why it is so important to restore that function, not to return to the old way of being, but to build a new one, more integrated, more conscious, more rooted. Jung said that individuation is the path back to the center, where the ego and the self learn to dialogue. And that dialogue demands humility. The ego must stop feeling like the owner of the psyche, but it also cannot nullify itself. It must recognize that it is part of something greater, and that its task is to cooperate with that whole. When this happens, a new motivation arises, no longer based on comparison, status, or control, but on expression, coherence, and meaning. It is at this point that motivation reappears as a natural consequence of an integrated psyche. You no longer act to prove something. You act because it is inevitable to express what dwells within you. And that action, however simple, carries a vital force that once seemed lost. If you feel disconnected, ungrounded, floating between the old and the new, perhaps it is time to restore the bridge with your ego. Not to cling to old forms, but to restart with awareness. To remember that the ego, when properly oriented, is not an obstacle, it is an ally. You are not here to deny your humanity. You are here to inhabit it fully, with soul. And that begins with reconnecting with your truest self, the one that does not need to be special, only whole. There comes a moment on the path of self-knowledge when everything that once made sense stops making sense. No philosophy is enough. No book, technique, or teaching can fill the void that opens. And this is not ordinary sadness nor fleeting discouragement. It is something deeper, more existential. It is as if you were observing your own life through fogged glass, feeling separated from everything, even from yourself. Jung knew this crossing well. He called it the dark night of the soul, a period where the symbolic structures sustaining the psyche collapse. The image of God that once comforted no longer makes sense. The values inherited from family, religion, society seem empty, fragile, arbitrary. And in that vacuum, an inevitable question arises. Why continue? Spiritual awakening, contrary to what many think, does not resolve this anguish. It deepens it, because now you see more clearly everything that was sustained by external conventions. And when those conventions dissolve, what remains is an open, silent field where meaning must be rediscovered or rebuilt from scratch. The loss of motivation at this stage is not a deviation, but a direct symptom of the breakdown of the old symbolic system. The soul feels that the old world has ended, but the new world has not yet been born. And that interval between worlds is devastating. Many call it depression, others call it an existential crisis. But, in Jungian language, it is an archetypal process. The ego is being confronted with the creative void, with the absence of external direction, so that something truer may emerge. Have you ever wondered why nothing that worked before seems to work now? Why the same songs, movies, friendships, and habits that once brought comfort now sound distant, as if belonging to another life? This happens because your soul no longer feeds on the same symbolic material, and until new images emerge, you will remain in this state of suspension. Most people try to get out of this void as quickly as possible. They seek new doctrines, new purposes, new systems offering ready-made answers. But those answers rarely touch what truly matters, because what is at stake here is not finding another model, but learning to bear the non-model, the silence, the absence of guarantees. Jung was very clear in stating that the meaning of life cannot be given from the outside. It must be lived, and for that, it is necessary to lose all inherited meanings. This crossing is neither pleasant nor comfortable. It is raw, solitary, sometimes cruel. But it is also the fertile ground where the soul begins to take deeper root, because only when you stop seeking meaning outside yourself do you begin to perceive what truly pulses within. At this point in the journey, the most important question is not, what should I do? But rather, what within me is dying, and what is trying to be born. The loss of motivation is often the mourning for old versions of yourself, roles that no longer fit, beliefs that no longer serve you, ideals that now feel empty. And like all mourning, this process needs respect. Forcing new motivation onto the void only generates more frustration, because the soul does not want to be pushed, it wants to be heard. This is one of the most dangerous moments on the spiritual journey, because here arise the risks of cynicism, despair, nihilism, the temptation to think that nothing is worth it anymore, that everything is an illusion. But this is only a phase, and not the conclusion. The dark night of the soul is not the end of the path. It is the moment when the soul gathers all its projections, all its idealizations, and returns to itself. Not out of selfishness, but out of necessity. Jung tells us that the encounter with the self is often accompanied by a profound feeling of loneliness, because the self is the most intimate and intransferable thing in us. That loneliness is inevitable, but it is also sacred, because it is in it that you begin to realize that the true meaning of life is not in external goals, but in internal coherence, in living according to what is true for you, even if no one else understands. The new meaning does not arise all at once. It comes in fragments, in small signs, in moments of silence when something within you whispers, a genuine desire, a forgotten memory, a spontaneous gesture, a will that does not come from fear or obligation, but from a silent joy. That is how the soul begins to breathe again. If you are in this stage now, do not hurry. Do not try to convince yourself that everything is fine. Just allow yourself to cross. What is dying is not you. It is the way you learn to see yourself. And when that form is dissolved, something new, more subtle, more faithful, more alive, will begin to emerge. There are no shortcuts in the dark night of the soul, but there is one certainty. If you keep walking, even without a map, even without a destination, at Some point the sun will rise again, and when it does, it will be different, because now it will not be a borrowed sun. It will be the light of your own consciousness, shining from within. After traversing the fall of the persona, the confrontation with the shadow, the dissolution of the ego and the void of the dark night of the soul, something begins to stir in silence. It is neither euphoria nor a grand epiphany. It is more like a whisper, a discreet but insistent call that seems to come from a place you always knew but had forgotten. It is at this point that many enter, unbeknownst, the journey of individuation. For Jung, individuation is the process of becoming what one already is in the deepest sense. Not what others expect, nor what you would like to be accepted, but what you already are in your totality, even if you are not yet conscious of it. It is the psychic movement that takes us from fragmentation to wholeness, from blind adaptation to authentic expression. But here is the paradox. Spiritual awakening usually triggers this process of individuation abruptly, as if the soul said enough and initiated an internal reorganization, even before the ego is prepared to follow. And when this happens, a confusing and painful interval arises, because you feel you no longer belong to the old world, but you still cannot inhabit the new. It's like being between two continents, without a bridge, floating at sea. You no longer fit into old circles, old habits, the same conversations. But you also haven't discovered your true places, choices, and expressions. What should be liberation turns into a state of suspension, and with that, motivation disappears. It is at this moment that many give up on the journey, not out of weakness but out of disorientation. They don't understand that this void is part of the process. They believe something went wrong, when in fact something much deeper is just beginning to reorganize. Individuation is not an abstract idea. It is real, alive, dynamic. It is like a natural cycle of the soul, which seeks to align all its parts, conscious and unconscious, around a more authentic center, which Jung called the self. But for that to happen, time is needed. You must traverse the layers of the psyche, face contradictions, revisit memories, reevaluate desires. During this process, it is common to experience symptoms such as disinterest in practical life, loss of identity, vocational confusion, social isolation, and internal crises that seem to have no cause. All of this is part of the deep adjustment between the ego and the self, and until that alignment begins to stabilize, the predominant feeling is one of being lost. But being lost does not mean being off course. Often, it is precisely when you feel most lost that the soul is doing the most silent and necessary work, toppling structures that no longer serve you, deconstructing illusions you fed yourself for years, cleaning the internal ground so something new can emerge, not as fantasy but as a rooted experience. Jung said that individuation demands a yes to one's own totality, a yes to light and shadow, to strength and fragility, to the desire to belong and the impulse to break free. That yes does not happen all at once. It is built gradually in small choices and great ruptures, in sincere internal conversations, in the courage to contradict yourself, in the patience to not rush. If you are at this moment now, where nothing fits, where old answers no longer work, where the soul seems silent, perhaps you are not stagnated. Perhaps you are being rebuilt from within. Perhaps your soul is preparing new ground so that true meaning can flourish. The motivation you think you lack has not disappeared. It is being purified, transformed, disidentified from old patterns. And until this transition is complete, it is natural to feel fatigue, confusion, and even a certain existential boredom. Do not fight it. Just remain conscious. Be present with what is alive now, even if it is silence. Individuation is not a destination, it is a process. And like any deep process, it involves ruptures, nebulous phases, and moments of profound loneliness. But it is precisely there that the soul finds its true axis. Not in the noise of the world, but in the silence of being. You are not standing still, you are gestating. And like any gestation, this process demands care, listening, and time. True motivation, that which is born from the self, does not hurry. It emerges at the right time, and when it arrives, it will be different from anything you have ever known, because it will not come from a need to prove something, but from the deep desire to express who you are. Your awakening was not the end. It was the beginning. And even if you still do not know where you are going, something within you has already begun to walk. Perhaps you are living exactly this sensation of discouragement, paralysis, loss of purpose, and now you begin to realize that this is not a mistake nor a failure. It is part of a process more profound, more honest, more courageous than any superficial motivation could sustain. What we call loss of motivation after spiritual awakening may actually be the beginning of your real journey. Not the journey to seek ready-made answers or repeat lofty discourses, but the journey to dive into yourself with open eyes and a present soul. Recalling the 5 points we explored together. First, you saw that the persona, the social mask, must fall so the true self can emerge. Then came the confrontation with the shadow, that denied territory that carries precisely the energy lacking in our conscious life. Next, we faced the disconnection with the ego, which often leaves us floating between extremes, either dissolved or inflated. Then we cross the dark night of the soul, where all previous meaning collapses and we are forced to open to mystery. Finally, we arrived at the realization that individuation has been initiated but not yet integrated, and that is why everything seems fragmented, undefined, suspended. But now you know, this state is not absence, it is gestation. Jung warned us that everything that disturbs our soul has something to teach us about ourselves. So if you feel you are in the dark, perhaps it is because your soul is teaching you to see without the eyes you always used, teaching you to trust the invisible, to sustain silence, to build meaning from within. What seemed like stagnation may, in fact, be a profound internal reorganization, a call to live with more coherence, to let go of masks that no longer serve, roles that limit you, and to listen to what is truly alive, even if it contradicts everything you believed until now. You don't need haste, you need presence. Because it's not about rushing off to do something new, it's about learning to inhabit this space between what has died and what is still being born. And perhaps, at this exact moment, your soul is asking, are you willing to listen to me even if I still don't speak with words? Are you willing to keep walking even without a map? Are you willing to trust even without understanding? If the answer is yes, even if silent, even if fragile, then you have already taken the most important step. Because true motivation, the one that transforms life, does not come from outside. It springs from the center, and that center is now beginning to awaken in you. If this video made sense to you, consider sharing it with someone who may also be going through this moment. Sometimes all we need is to know we are not alone. And if you want to continue with me on this journey of profound self-knowledge, subscribe to the channel. Here we do not seek perfection, we seek wholeness. And it begins exactly where you are now. Your emptiness is not the end. It is the soil where your new soul is learning to be born.